Welcome to Cybersecurity Today. This is the Week in Review for the week ending Friday, April 19th, 2024. I'm Howard Solomon. In a few minutes, Jen Ellis, a member of the Ransomware Task Force, will be here to talk about the group's recent report on what governments need to do before banning ransomware payments. But first, a look at some of the headlines from the past 7 days. Sophisticated cyber attacks aren't new, but old-fashioned brute force credential attacks are still being used by threat actors. Researchers at Cisco Systems' Thales Threat Intelligence Service say brute force attacks have increased since March. The targets are wide and include virtual private network services, web application authentication interfaces, and SSH services. IT leaders should make sure this type of attack is made difficult by having all employees use multi-factor authentication and other defensive tactics. Russia's Sandworm cyber group has been upgraded to an advanced persistent threat actor by researchers at Mandiant, an arm of the Russian military. Sandworm is linked to the NotPetya data wiper that was aimed at Ukraine but escaped around the world, as well as cyber attacks in 2015 and 2016 on Ukraine's energy grid. But Mandiant also warns that this group has tools for collecting intelligence, spreading disinformation, and sabotaging IT networks in any country to support Russia's political aims. Separately, Microsoft warned in a report that Russia has increased its anti-Ukraine disinformation messages to Americans online in the run-up to this year's U.S. elections. This includes video commentary spread by websites that are covertly managed by Russia. The report also says China is in the game, using artificial intelligence applications to create videos and manipulated images. At the same time, the U.S. Director of National Intelligence issued an 8-page report on the latest tactics by Russia, China, and Iran to undermine confidence in the upcoming U.S. elections. They're doing it through fake online personas on social media. Organizations using SAP's business applications continue to be targeted by threat actors. That's according to researchers at Omnatsys and Flashpoint. No doubt it's because some of the biggest companies in the world use SAP software. How valuable is it to an attacker? Well, the prices hackers are paying to buy a remote exploit for SAP applications has increased 400% in the past 4 years. What's of concern is that many victims have SAP installations without the latest patches. IT staff in charge of patch management have been warned. United Health, the American parent company of Change Healthcare, said in a regulatory filing that the first quarter cost of handling February's ransomware attack came to $872 million. The news service The Register notes that that's on top of perhaps as much as $6 billion in advanced funding and interest-free loans that United Health has had to give many support care providers using its services. An arm of the United Nations has admitted being hit recently by ransomware. The UN Development Program told the cybersecurity news service The Record that data on current and past employees was stolen from a server. The 8-base ransomware gang is taking credit for the attack. The same gang is taking credit for a ransomware attack on the Atlantic States Maritime Fisheries Commission. An attack on New York State has disrupted work printing legislation, as well as printing the upcoming budget. A Michigan healthcare provider is notifying over 184,000 people their data was stolen last February. Cherry Street Services, which provides primary, dental, vision, and other healthcare services, says data stolen includes names, dates of birth, social security numbers, diagnoses and treatment information, health insurance information, and more. And the Roman Catholic Diocese of Phoenix, Arizona is notifying over 23,000 people, including those in the diocese employee benefits plan, that their data was stolen. The incident was discovered in January. People's names, addresses, dates of birth, and social security numbers were copied. Joining me now from Cambridge, England, to talk about fighting ransomware is Jen Ellis, a co-chair of the Ransomware Task Force. Welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I've asked you to be on the show because last week the task force, which is an international group of experts, issued its third report since 2021, a roadmap to the potential prohibition of ransomware payments. It outlines a roughly 2-year plan for what ought to be done if governments want to institute a ban on ransomware payments. We'll talk about that report in a minute. But first, Jen, tell us a bit about yourself.
Okay. I will try to be interesting. So I'm Jen. Hi. As you can probably tell, I'm British, but I started doing policy engagement when I lived in the US, which I did for many years. Actually quite close to the other Cambridge, the other famous one. And I worked in cybersecurity for blah 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 15 years, something like that, and worked very, very closely with security researchers for a long time. Started to understand that the legal environment in the US was chilling research and hurting, I think, both the security industry, but also, much more importantly, society as a whole, right? Holding back security information from society as a whole, which I thought was a bad scene. So I started to get involved and interested in policy. It expanded really quickly from there into looking at all sorts of different areas around policy connected to cybersecurity, and also looking at how we could bridge the gap between the policy community and the technical community, so that as the policy community is looking at policy around technical topics, we're plugging in people who are actually working on the front lines of this, who have the real technical knowledge, and they understand what's coming, right? I think that bridge is super important. So fast forward to 2020, when we started looking at this ransomware issue in the RTF and pulled that together. But so now these days I work with nonprofits and with governments to, one, bridge that gap, and two, help sort of assist with developing policy positions around cyber. And I also co-host the Distilling Cyber Policy podcast. There's nothing like a shameless plug for another podcast when you're on a podcast. So if you're interested in cyber policy, please check out the Distilling Cyber Policy podcast.
What are the goals of the Ransomware Task Force?
Yeah, okay, so I'll take you back in time. Come with me on a journey through time. Back to 2020, which was obviously a stellar year for everybody. And one of the things that happened was that we saw this continued increase in ransomware attacks. And at the time, what was particularly troubling was a lot of them were hitting hospitals, which it was not a good year for hospitals generally. So we did not want them to be also hit by ransomware on top of everything else they were dealing with. So we kind of had this moment. There's an organization, a nonprofit organization called the Institute for Security and Technology, which sits at the intersection of national security and technology. And they had kind of observed this problem with the hospitals getting attacked. And they said, at this point, we believe that ransomware is a national security threat because of the impact it's having on our ability to give healthcare during a global pandemic. So they also noted, very importantly, that you may remember 2020 was an election year. And so they noted that there would be a new administration coming in. The new administration had indicated that they would be committing more resources and more time and effort to cybersecurity as an issue. So what IST sort of quite savvily thought is they thought, right, we have a window here where we can get together some people who have like expertise and passion on this topic, and we can come up with a set of recommendations that are not aimed at like, hey, organization, you need to do these things to protect yourself, because there's lots of that kind of data out there. Instead, they were focused specifically on advice to governments about what governments should be doing from a policy and operational point of view to address the ransomware threat. And they had this window. They knew that they had this window before the administration kind of got, fully ramped and had built its agenda or strategy for cyber policy. They could say to them, look, ransomware is a really big problem. These are some things we think you should work on as you look at how you're going to address cyber crime across the next period of the administration. So that was sort of the goal. We brought together over 100 different people, not just from the US, as you can tell from my accent, although I was in the US at the time, but also from Canada, the UK, Australia, all around the world, really. And from every sort of area that related to the topic. So we had cyber insurers, we had incident responders, we had lawyers, we had governments, law enforcement. We had companies that had been hit and companies that hadn't been hit but were worried about being hit. We had tiny companies and big companies. So we could really try and get as full a picture of the situation as possible and understand a lot of what was creating friction.
Okay. It seems that because the number of reported successful ransomware attacks continues to increase, that
Yes.
little progress is being made. And
Yeah.
in the task force recent report, it says the majority of organizations globally are still underprepared to defend against or recover
Yeah.
from a ransomware attack.
Yeah.
Why?
Um, I wish there was a really simple answer to give you. I mean, if I wanted to be like, flippant, the simple answer I would give you is life. Because there's so much layers of complexity here around, competing demands on resources, competing demands on time and on attention, a lack of true understanding about what's going on, an ability and an inability for organizations to respond appropriately. There's so much noise out there and so little of it helps organizations really understand what to do. Incentives work in the wrong direction in many cases. For example, the incentives around companies that make technology are to constantly be building really quickly and moving on to the next thing. It's not to be like taking your time, doing it right, making sure you've tested for everything, going back and acknowledging vulnerabilities in your technology, right? All of the incentives work in the wrong direction for security to work. And so we have an ecosystem where we have the vast majority of companies can't afford, haven't invested, don't have capacity to have good preparedness or resilience. We have opportunities for attackers abounding, both in terms of opportunities in the technology itself, vulnerabilities, as I mentioned, or just the fact that it's really easy for them to manipulate human behavior. And we all have to interact with these connected technologies now. So there's a lot of different factors at play that mean it's really hard, which is why when the report came out, it had 48 recommendations. We would have loved to have come up with one, right? If we could have all agreed that this one thing would do it, that's what we'd have gone for. But the problem is, and this is I'm sure you've heard this a million times before, we always say in security, there are no silver bullets in security, unfortunately. And actually, what we were looking at is like incremental things you can do that if you do them all together will hopefully create an impact. And while there has been progress on a number of those things, often it isn't just about pulling the lever, it's about maintaining focus and maintaining investment and commitment over time, which actually often is much harder than taking that first step. And so we haven't had long enough yet to see this stuff come to fruition. And we actually, if you think about it, I don't know what the percentage is in the US, but in the UK, our economy is 98% small to medium businesses. Most of them are well below the cybersecurity poverty line. They can't and have not invested to a degree that they need to. Meanwhile, the attackers are making big money. They're able to invest every day if they want to. So, those are some of the challenges at play. It's not a complete picture because there's a lot, but it's some of the challenges.
As you said, that first report included 48 recommendations for
Yeah.
both governments and companies. If you're an IT leader in a company
Mm.
or in a county or municipality, like, are there three, five things
Yeah.
you
Yes.
really should do that will make a
There
really
are.
big impact?
Yeah, there are. Most people agree on what the core sort of five things are. So, just as a point of clarification, the original report was aimed at policymakers. It was not aimed at end user organizations at all. There are plenty of documents out there that will provide guidance. The RTF did subsequently create one aimed specifically at small to medium businesses that they created in partnership with CIS, which was called a blueprint, which was trying to sort of break it down and make it more bite sized for small to medium businesses. And the reason for that is like, I'm going to tell you five things. And when we rattle them off as a list of five things, it sounds really straightforward. But the reality is, each one of them is a really time consuming major thing. And it's not like one and done. You don't do it and then you're done. It's an ongoing commitment. So it's not like you get up and you're like, hey, on Monday, I'm going to institute patching. And on Tuesday, I'm going to institute identity and access management. And on Wednesday, I'm going to make sure that I've got offline backups and I'm going to check that they've not been poisoned in some way. These are not things that go that way. It's more like my major goal for this year is going to be that I can get off its feet a proper functioning vulnerability management program. And that's going to be a big investment of time and effort and understanding and configuration and buy-in across my organization and talking to the IT team. And so like it is really important to understand when we go through what the things are that they're not simple, easy lifts. But so I gave you three of them. So one is patching. You need to patch your stuff, have a vulnerability management program. If you're listening to this and you're wondering about how to get started, a really good resource for you is CISA's Known Exploited Vulnerabilities Catalog, which specifically highlights the vulnerabilities that they know are being exploited in the wild. So it gives you a prioritization level. So that's one. Identity and access management. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that CISA is the U.S. Cybersecurity and
Yes.
Infrastructure Security Agency.
Thank you. Yes, they like security so much they put it in their name twice is the joke that they make, and I like that joke. Yes, thank you for clarifying that. So another one would be, and these are not, by the way, in a prioritized order, so please don't take them as if they are. Another one would be to have identity and access management program in place. So this is who accesses what and when. So you want to make sure that people only have the ability to access things that they need to access. You're not giving broad access across your organization. And also that when they access those things, it's hard. Like there has to be some, for example, secondary factor of authentication so that if somebody gets tricked into giving away credentials, that it's not easy for the attackers to use those credentials, right? So identity and access management, you need to think about it fully across the board in terms of what that means to you as a program. Third thing is you need an eye on resilience, right? You always work on a basis, you're trying to make it as hard as possible for attackers to get in, but you're never going to make it completely impossible. You're not going to be the CIA and have a hopefully quite bulletproof system. So if people get in, you're trying to minimize the impact to you as an organization, and you are trying to make it such that you can bounce back as quickly as possible, right? So resilience is really, really important. So backups of all of the stuff that you care about the most, not just your data, but your systems as well. And also checking that your backups are offline, so they're not easy to access, and that you're checking regularly that there's no sign of any dodgy behavior in those backups, right? That's a really important piece and a good thing to do. Recently, we've seen extortion-based attacks, which is, a fancier way of saying ransomware, move away from the more traditional ransom model of locking you out of your systems and then ransoming you getting access, to instead stealing your data and then ransoming the data to you to say, we're going to sell it on the dark web. So encrypt your data. If you can encrypt your data, you make it not valuable to them. And it means that also when they say to you, hey, give us your money or we'll do X, you're dealing with criminals. You might think, oh, I'm going to give them money and they're going to give me my data back. But I mean, how do you know? How do you know they've not kept a copy of it? We actually know from recent takedowns that they do keep copies, right? We just saw law enforcement big takedown in February of Lockbit, one of the most prolific cybercriminal gangs in the world. And from the files that they accessed, they could see that even when they had, quote unquote, returned data, they'd actually kept copies of it and they were using those copies to do things. So encrypt your data as far as you're able to do. And then email filtering is the other thing. The number one attack vector is still phishing and social engineering. So you want to make sure that you're doing awareness to your employees and helping educate them on what threats look like, what suspicious phone call sounds like, but also you want to try and filter out dodgy traffic from your email as much as possible to reduce the amount that this is getting through to your employees. So there you go. Simple, right? Sorted.
Oh, yeah.
Right. It's just a
So,
busy week for someone.
so those are five of
Yeah.
the recommendations from the task
Well,
force in
no.
their.
No. So those are what I would tell an end user organization to do. But that's
Okay.
not what we were for policymakers. We were looking at policy interventions.
Right.
So we were not, the things we were focused on for policymakers was 4 lines of inquiry. How do you deter attacks? How do you disrupt attacks? And how do you, at scale, help your nation prepare and respond for attacks? So those
Right.
are the 4 lines of inquiry.
Right. But in the blueprint for ransomware defense,
Yeah.
there's a long list of things
Yes.
that companies and IT departments ought to be
Yeah.
doing. What are the biggest roadblocks do you hear from business and IT leaders about not being able to implement task force recommendations for fighting ransomware in their firms?
Um, you could put it very simply and say it's about capacity or capability. And really, what that boils down to is the causes behind that are a lack of understanding or a lack of resources. So either you have an organization that doesn't really understand the threat, doesn't really understand its relevance to that organization, or you have an organization that is unable to invest. And sometimes you have organizations that both are true or that one affects the other. So I might be in a situation where I'm the lead professional, security professional in an organization, or the lead IT professional, and I've done my homework and I understand this threat. And I go to my leadership and I say, hey, there's this thing, you should read these headlines. Did you just hear about this attack? And they'll go, well, it doesn't relate to us. And we've got 5,000 other things that we've got to spend our money on. And we're having to cut back because of inflation and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And these are the realities of business. You're always, always, always making payoffs. You're always making decisions between one thing and another thing. You can't do everything you want to do. And you have a responsibility to your employees, your customers, and your investors to not do everything that you want to do, to be honest. So they have to make difficult decisions. They have to decide how to prioritize. And because they don't understand the threat, they maybe choose, or because they have other more urgent, pressing priorities in other areas, they make choices away from spending on cybersecurity. There isn't a way really of doing it that doesn't involve spending money. So I think that's the difficulty. There is a perception that ransomware attacks are targeted. And a lot of that is to do with the language we use, but it's also, I think, a little bit with how people think about, the concept of ransoms. In the old days, when we talked about ransoms, it was generally because of something like a kidnap situation. And in a kidnap situation, it is targeted, right? You are specifically going after an individual. That's not how the internet works. The degree to which ransomware attacks are targeted is you might go to a broker and say, I want to hit companies above 10 million in revenue in the US. And you'll get a long list and then you'll send some stuff out. But the nature of the beast is that you're sending out on the internet where everything is interconnected. And if it goes further, if it hits somebody else that doesn't meet that standard, you're not going to be like, actually, we do see this. We see them go, oopsie. Or we see them sometimes not follow up on making a demand because they've ruled a company as being below the line that's interesting to them. But it doesn't change the fact that company got hit, that they had the negative impact, they had the cost that came with that. So I think there has to be a view here of trying to help organizations understand that if you do business that involves the internet in some way, then you are a potential victim of these attacks, not because you've been targeted. You don't need to be interesting enough or flashy enough to get on someone's radar. You just need to open an email. It's as simple as that. And everybody's getting email every day.
As I said earlier, last week the task force issued a roadmap for what governments should do before forbidding organizations from paying ransoms. And the reason why a government may want to institute a ransomware ban is to choke off the revenue that crooks get.
Yeah.
Why are some organizations still paying?
Because it's so hard, right? Say you're the CEO of a regional, smallish manufacturing company, and you're a third generation owner, right? Company's been in your business for 3 generations, and you have dedicated your entire life to this business. You employ a bunch of people in your region. You're one of the employers in a fairly not hyper populated area, and you are not you are a small to medium sized business. You don't have a lot of money to invest in cybersecurity, probably not something you really think about a huge amount, and you're super reliant on 5 major customers that you've got contracts with to create whatever widget for them, right? You get hit by a ransomware attack and it takes your business offline, and all of a sudden some piece of equipment that you're super reliant on doesn't work, and your business grinds to a halt. Now, your customers have deadlines, and their deadlines can't be shifted just because you can't provide that service. So all of a sudden, the situation that you're in is existential for your business. If you cannot provide the service you guaranteed you would, you're going to lose those contracts. They're going to go elsewhere. Your reputation is shot. You might get sued by them. And you are now looking at a situation where your business might literally go down the pan over a cyber attack that never even hit your radar as being a possibility. And so suddenly, and that's all the people you employ out of work, it's your family's legacy gone. For people who are in a situation like that, they're going to say, how do I make this problem go away as quickly, as painlessly as possible? And actually, those same dynamics are in operation at different levels of scale and complexity for all sorts of organizations, right? You don't have to be a small regional XXX. You could be in critical infrastructure. I think in the US, it's almost impossible not to be part of critical infrastructure the way it's currently defined. And you're providing critical service, and you have no tolerance for disruption. So again, you get hit. You're a regional hospital. You want to be able to provide medical services. If you can't, people might literally die. You're a water plant. You have to be able to continue to do water purification. If you can't do that, people might die, right? Like there are real. I'm laughing because it's this horrible, right? So there are real reasons why people pay. Nobody wants to. Nobody goes, you know what I really want to do with my hard-earned money is I want to give it to a criminal in a foreign state who doesn't care about anything to do with me and takes pictures of himself riding around in his Lamborghini. Nobody's like, that's what I want to do. Please let me fund crime in another country. No, that is not what people want to do, but they're doing it out of desperation because they don't wake up to this problem until it's too late.
So what are the pros and cons of a ransomware ban?
So there are a few reasons people want one, and the reasons are pretty solid. The first theory is this: ransomware is a crime that exists in interests of making money for criminals. If you take away the money, then you take away the impetus for doing it and it goes away, right? So that's number one reason why people want to do it. Number two reason why they want to do it is because, as previously mentioned, giving money to these criminals is galling, disgusting, unethical. Like, use your word that you want. People don't like it. It doesn't feel good. A lot of these organized criminal gangs are involved in other types of organized crime. Nobody wants to think that they're funding the drug trade or the weapons trade or human trafficking. So, there are all sorts of reasons why people say, no, we don't want to do it from a moral point of view. The third reason that policymakers want a ban is because they have tried to push this needle on building preparedness, and it's not going quickly, as we already talked about, because of all the things we talked about. And so they think, well, maybe we've tried the carrot and the carrot hasn't got anywhere. Maybe now we try a stick in form of saying to people, you will not be able to pay a ransom. Therefore, you have to get ahead of this. You have to have preparedness because there is no parachute here. So those are the main reasons why people want to do it. And I completely agree with all of those reasons. Like, I have no argument with any of those reasons. The problem is we don't live in a beautiful black and white world. We live in a world of complexity and nuance where people will push boundaries every time because of desperation or because of meanness or whatever. So the first one we talk about is we will have a ban and the money will dry up, and so they will stop doing it. Well, I have never heard of a story of a lovely criminal who lost their revenue stream and thought, well, I guess I'll go and get a day job then, and suddenly turns away from illegal activity. I think it's far likelier that before they do that, they will test the mettle of organizations. So where I said today that ransomware attacks are not super targeted, they would suddenly likely become targeted. Because if I was a ransomware attacker, and for the record, I am not, what I would do is I would shift to focusing specifically on critical infrastructure and small businesses, because I know that they're the least likely to withstand my demands for a ransom. They're the most likely to pay under the table and put themselves in a bad position. So that's the first problem, is that you basically paint a giant target on the back of your most vulnerable organizations and arguably the ones that you want to protect the most, right? The other problem is that, you can say, well, we'll tough it out. And that's a nice idea that we would tough it out. But if we're going to tough it out, we have to have a plan for what toughing it out means, right? So, how do you go to organizations and say, hey, we know you've got no preparedness, but we're going to do this thing anyway? And look, I get it. I get that you can say to people, we're going to do this in 2 years. This is going to happen. So you've got 2 years to get yourself sorted. But I think there has to be a plan for how to help them get themselves sorted. And, there's this idea of, well, we'll have a ban, but then if somebody gets hit, they can apply for an exemption to get paid. Well, that's absurd. Then what you're doing is you're saying that entities that could qualify for an exemption, you're painting a target on them. Obviously, the attackers are going to focus specifically on the types of organizations that might qualify. Plus, now you've got a situation where they have to go through an exemption application process, which will take forever. So you're not talking about like rapid restoring of business here. So these are some of the challenges. I mean, I would also say that like, even if we get through that horrible transition period and we hold our mettle and we provide support for organizations and we have the ban and the attackers realize there is no revenue stream, they're still not going to go and get day jobs. They're still not going to go and like turn to a life of legality. They're going to go do something else criminal. That is admittedly a problem for down the road. And I'm fine with the idea of having a ban and then solving that set of problems when we come to them. But make no mistake, like this idea that it's a switch that you can turn off and you can just be like, right, we're not paying. So we've got no more cyber criminals, right? Good, good, cool. Like, that's just nonsense. It's not how it works at all.
Of the steps that the task force recommends towards preparing for a ban on ransomware payments, which do you think are the easiest and which are the hardest to implement?
Yeah. Oof. That is a great question. So, I think that the ones that are somewhat easiest, looking at the policymaker recommendations, right, the actual core task force recommendations, I think to an extent, the government is most easily able to control the stuff that the government does itself, right? So it can, for example, collaborate with other governments. It can make a decision to do that, and it has. It created something called the International Counter Ransomware Initiative, which now has 50 different nation states as members, and they are collaborating on ways to address the problem. The government can institute sanctions. That's a thing the government can do, and it has. US government has introduced a bunch of sanctions, both against specific ransomware groups and also against some currency exchanges. It's a little bit of a game of whack-a-mole, but it's a thing that they can do. They can introduce, like one of the big ones was there's a real problem with a lack of data and clarity and understanding, a lack of reporting. So the US government introduced reporting requirements in two different ways, one through the SEC for publicly traded companies, and then one for critical infrastructure through the Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act, SACIA, which is going through, the process to figure out what the requirements will actually be. So these are things that like the government could decide that it's going to participate in disruptive campaigns. It can have its law enforcement work with law enforcement around the world to do takedowns. So the Lockbit case that I referenced earlier, which happened in February, that was a collaboration of governments around the world, law enforcement around the world, and they worked really hard to be able to sort of take apart this organized crime group and undermine their infrastructure and their affiliates and all this kind of stuff. So these are things that governments can do, and this is where they've made the most progress, is on the steps that are somewhat operational. You can decide as a government that you're going to institute requirements on entities that do business with you. So you can say to them like, hey, if you're going to sell us technology, you have to do these things. So that's the kind of stuff that the government can do and it can get done. And it's not a light lift. Like obviously it takes resources and it takes focus and it takes time, but it's within the government's control to do it. So it's a matter of prioritization. What's much, much, much harder is stuff that is outside of the government's direct operational field. So things like, reaching into the millions of small to medium businesses that are in the economy and driving them to take action is really hard, because you don't want to make it a regulatory thing if you can avoid it, because you understand that there are a lot of other equities at play, a lot of other priorities and needs and demands, and also we don't want to over legislate and over regulate small business. So things like that, the sort of disruption and deterrence pieces are a little bit easier. The preparation and response pieces are a little bit harder. And then the other thing that's really hard is one of the big problems that we have is cyber criminal gangs have for a long time thrived in what we call safe havens or harbor nations, harbor countries that basically protect them. And to some extent, there's a view that actually these cybercriminal gangs' activities support the political ambitions of their governments, and that's why they get this level of protection, right? We would obviously love to dismantle the safe havens, to like take that shelter away from the cyber criminals. The reality is, though, because as I mentioned, there is a view that it supports the sort of political ambitions of those nations, that most of the nations where these cyber criminals gather and thrive are nations that we don't necessarily have the friendliest relationships with. We may not have the most leverage to create change. So North Korea would be an example. Russia would be an example. These are countries where we don't actually have that much we can do now. We've kind of used the levers that we have. We've applied a lot of sanctions to both those countries. And actually, if you look at them, there's a much bigger situation, right? There's a much bigger diplomatic question mark than just the one relating to ransomware or cybercrime. And we have to look at it as part of a much bigger picture of, posturing over, for example, nuclear war. So that's an area that's really hard for them to make progress, is going after those safe havens. So yeah, there's a
Um,
lot of complexity again. Sorry.
no, among the recommendations are create a ransomware response fund to help victim organizations recover. And another is end the tax deductibility of ransomware payments.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, doesn't it seem a little bit nuts to you that you can give money to criminals and then you can take that as a tax write-off? That seem crazy?
Um,
Maybe that's just me. Sorry, it seems nuts to me. I just can't think of another space where that would be the thing, right? Like when I do my tax return, I'm like, here's all the money I gave to charity this year, and then here's all the money that I gave to criminals this year, and I would like a benefit for both, please. Like that seems kind of crazy to me. So yes, we asked for that, and hey, if you didn't get a write-off for it and you had to pay tax on it, maybe that money could be used to help with the fund. Because I mean, like, look, if you're gonna try and get to a point of a ban, and you know that the vast majority of organizations in your economy don't have an appropriate level of resilience, then you either have to provide the resilience for them or provide the means to create the resilience. I mean, otherwise, you're basically just abandoning them. And I think that's a real problem. So I don't want to see us in a situation where we lose a bunch of small businesses over this issue. And so that's where the idea was basically that the fund would be, you would have to repay it, but the terms would be favorable. So it wouldn't be crippling. It would be manageable. We know that the government doesn't have a never-ending pot of cash. It seems like it, but they don't. And so we're not suggesting that and in fact, we wouldn't want them to just outright pay, because that would disincentivize people adopting security practices. And we want people to get better at this. But we do want to recognize that there is a gap and there needs to be a bridge for that gap.
Finally, I'm an IT or security leader. I don't have enough money or people to fight cyber attacks, including ransomware. How do I persuade my boss to
Yeah.
give me more?
So there is a saying that we use in security, which is never let a crisis go to waste. And I would say, you can do a lot by sort of scouring the headlines and highlighting relevant stories. I think, there has to be a little bit of education here. But the reality is, if you seem disconnected from the realities of the business, your business leaders will never take you seriously. So if you go to them and you're like, let me tell you about all the things going on in security, and you completely ignore the fact that the business is also worried about the economy, for example, or facilities, weather, climate, investors, employee well-being, changing laws. If you're completely disconnected from all of these other things, then you're going to have a conversation that is so far removed from what they actually focus on and think about that they're not going to take you seriously. So I think it's a two-way street of education. You have to educate yourself on what the business cares about, like get to know the business leaders in the organization and go talk to people who are maybe leaders of like sub areas in the business. So like I'm not suggesting you should take your entire exec staff out for lunch. Maybe they don't have time for that, but like maybe you could take sort of lower down department heads out and learn what it is that they focus on and care about and what their priorities are, because then you'll get a view of how the business all goes together and what the competing equities are, right? What the competing priorities are. That gives you a much better position to go have that conversation with your leadership because you understand a lot more about what they're weighing up. So that's your piece on educating yourself and also obviously reading and et cetera, et cetera. And then there's the piece around educating others. And that's not just about going to your bosses. Like, again, when you take your coworkers out for lunch, this is also an opportunity to help them understand why you care about what you do and why they should care about it. Like, make it into how it matters to them. Always try and make it tangible to the stuff they deal with every day. And that way it's much more relatable. And then you're more likely to have people across the organization who care about this, which means it'll sort of bubble up, right? It'll percolate up to leadership and it'll put you in a better stance to have those conversations with them. And then use the examples and the proof points. I always get a little wary of attribution, but one of the things that attribution can be helpful for is it gives you stories about people to tell. And those stories help to create color. They help to make it real to your leaders to kind of go like, this is what a cybercrime gang looks like. Here's this guy. And he, has been doing this for this long. These are the things that he's accused of. Here he is driving around in his Lamborghini. I'm very fixated on the Lamborghinis, obviously. But like any of those things that you can do that make it feel like it's not just this sort of nebulous idea that's meaningless to them, that they can't relate to, that you want to make it into a real thing.
Jen, this has been really, really terrific. Thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's I feel like I've just rambled at you, but hopefully there was something useful in there.
There was a lot useful. Links to details about news mentioned in this podcast episode are in the text version at itworldcanada.com and technewsday.com. Follow Cybersecurity Today on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or add us to your flash briefing on your smart speaker. Thanks for listening. Have a great weekend. I'm Howard Solomon.